In our modern ontological context, shaped by the deployment of the symbolic tool of race, we're primarily defined spatially and representationally through the outcomes of post-Enlightenment reason, namely capitalism and the juridical state. Through domination of every sort, this social construction sets the terms of the human. As Denise Ferreira da Silva argues, the formulation of race is not extraneous to the ontology of the modern subject. It is in fact central and formative of it. If we are to take this to be a true condition belying our existence as modern or contemporary subjects, then it must also hold that the practices of modern contemporary artistic production are similarly defined by the core strains of aesthetic philosophy at the foundation derived from the Western episteme. What are the implications of this assumption? What if we do not simply make a metaphor of the colonial roots of Western aesthetic practice and in fact take up the job of tracing them back and identifying how they lead to our current landings? I'll spend my short time here today to suggest that art and visual culture are not only tools for describing racial difference and exclusion, but they are also themselves shaped by the racial construction of the modern Western episteme. What I offer in response to this proposition is a provisional mapping of the formative racial coordinates that mark the starting points for current perceptions and practices of the visual. I will attempt to do this by both identifying the trajectories of whiteness through the spatial and the pictorial, and also by identifying how blackness has been defined and adapted to survive these conditions. I will make some suggestions as to how these positions constitute the modern racial aesthetic context through a handful of examples. From here, I will offer some propositions for moving through and around the racial aesthetic regime, at least momentarily, and consider how we might feel our bodies out of sight. Our world holds vision above other senses as a primary way of knowing, organizing, and controlling experience. Practices of observation, categorization, and surveillance reproduce the modern subject through acts and technologies of looking. Outward appearance and surfaces were central preoccupations of post-Enlightenment and modern aesthetic philosophies, which form the cornerstone of our current frameworks for identity. Racialization takes hold in this process of visual representation of the subject, crystallized through the most prominent outward visual characteristics of skin, hair, facial features, and genitalia, the epidermal schema that puts us in our place. Through its omnipresence and overrepresentation, whiteness continually reinscribes its camouflage. The cloaked operation and thus invisibility of whiteness demands the transparency of all others. The violence of this demand for transparency is a perennial trait of whiteness. As Rolando Vasquez puts it, the lover of purity, embodying the inner eyes of the Western episteme, is not only searching for domination and abstraction, but also for a safe position, a position of innocence, a position of certainty, a position where one cannot see oneself as implicated in the colonial difference, a position where one cannot take responsibility. It is a position that in its claim to the norm, to abstraction, is ignorant of its own positionality. The surface as essence thesis is what I will begin unpacking through readings of foundational images and texts of the Western tradition that beget the modern and contemporary paradigms. I'll depart from what Sylvia Wynter identifies as the founding premise on which our present order of knowledge, or episteme, and its rigorously elaborated disciplinary paradigms are based. Namely, the aesthetic roots of racial categorization told through a handful of salient examples, which illustrate the dominance of vision in our world order, and the attendant iconography, tropes, and values of whiteness that haunt contemporary representational space. The founding aesthetic narratives and technologies of Western image culture, drawing and painting, sculpture, architecture, and photography, have been instrumental in establishing and preserving racial constructs that persist within our popular imagination. I'd like to share some case studies that shed a light on the anatomy of whiteness in European and American visual traditions. These visions of whiteness are persistent and formative of a lexicon that continues to inform how our bodies are seen and interpreted. They are exemplary of the imbrication of ideology, academic practice, and technology that uphold standard perceptions of self in our world. Any visual account of whiteness will predictably address pure white as the aesthetic baseline and beauty ideal of the West. We can look back to the founding of the discipline of art history to locate one origin point for the dominant order of whiteness in the Western aesthetic mythos. The pure whiteness of marble that we associate with works of classical antiquity belies the aesthetics of the West in such a foundational and obvious way that it's easy to take it for granted. This image of gleaming and placid whiteness as the pinnacle of artistic achievement constitutes the foundational myth of Western art. For this, we can thank Johann Joachim Winckelmann, known as one of the founding fathers of Western art history. An early and influential Hellenist, Winckelmann is also widely known as the prophet of modern archaeology, as his work set the stage for the systematic disciplinary study of art, beginning with the classification of Greek objects. He's also responsible for our false understanding that Greek statues existed originally as purely white. It is now more widely known that Greek statues were often painted in bright polychromatic hues. Whether through willful denial or misinformed research, Winckelmann established the tradition of replicating Greek statues in white Italian marble or plaster, a practice which is so firmly instantiated as to hardly seem remarkable as the originating source code of the white beauty ideal. Winckelmann's white male Greek aesthetic was formative to the visual culture and science of Europe in his day, formalizing a lie into central aesthetic values that would remain firmly in place forever after. Through the writings of Wolfgang von Goethe, the aesthetics associated with ancient Greece took root in the Germanic neoclassical tradition and manifested in subsequent generations through iterations of mythologies which fabricated lineages connecting Greeks to the pure white Aryan race. Johann Caspar Levanter, a poet and Protestant clergyman, would advance Winckelmann's aesthetic premise, holding that one's physical appearance was a direct reflection of inner worth, identifying the Eurocentric hierarchy of this beauty standard in his writing On Physiognomy. While Levanter's work eventually fell out of favor with scientists of his day, the central notion of outer appearance reflecting inner essence has remained firmly entrenched in the Western psyche. In a series of lectures given at the Amsterdam Drawing Academy in 1770, Petrus Camper, 18th century Dutch physician, anatomist, zoologist, anthropologist, and naturalist, and a contemporary of Winckelmann, introduced his theory of the facial angle, which identifies two invisible lines defining vertical and horizontal angles of the face designed to quantify proportions of facial features and correlate them to a hierarchy of beauty. The facial angle was a tool intended to provide artists with a mathematical method for proportioning the facial features of their subjects. Instead, the visual schematic illustrating the facial angle presents another foundational representation of racial hierarchy, placing the head of an African and Kalmuk next to the skull of an orangutan, and the head of a European next to the representation of the Apollo of Belvedere. This work won Camper a place in the Royal Society of England. Ironically, what Camper believed his facial angle proved was in fact the relative visual similarity between human races. While the theory of the facial angle was eventually refuted by his contemporaries. The visual diagram went on to serve as the basis for future arguments for white supremacy, scientific and medical racism, extending from the days of the transatlantic slave trade to the modern and contemporary white nationalist movements. The white walls of artistic institutions, like the one we are in today, are not only a metaphor for white supremacy. They are vestigial appendages that evolved out of the anxieties and aspirations of the emergent order of modernity that would come to dominate the global visual culture thereafter. Modern preoccupations with hygiene, infectious disease, and colonial others influenced the embrace of flat, light-colored interior walls, which would practically and metaphorically allow for the eradication of impurities. Le Corbusier, a canonical modern architect, once called whitewash, quote, extremely moral, and worked to establish its values throughout his body of work. Whiteness as a technology of surveillance and agent of purity appears again as a founding tenet of the modern white cube aesthetic. Paradoxically, architects of the international style like Corbusier also incorporated stylistic elements drawn from North African and Arab architectural aesthetics in their buildings. These forms favoring wide open spaces, airflow, and sunlight were derided and attacked by proto-Nazi critics, yet also exemplified the height of European achievement in spatial design. The pervasive use of black and white photography to reproduce these buildings and their interiors erased the fact that many of the walls of these spaces were lightly colored, off-white, and pastel. The photographic representation of these surfaces made for magazines reinforced the primacy of the white-walled interior that would universally define our living and cultural spaces. In the modern era, largely defined by photography as the dominant mode of visual reproduction, we also find the problematic and revealing relationship to the medium to dark skin. Shirley cards, used to calibrate Kodak film pictures, used the white, mostly female figure as its baseline. The conditions and proclivities that led to the now well-documented bias of Kodak film towards white skin live on and continue to appear in the discrepant applications of visual and digital technologies in the present day, namely the dominance of white people in fields of design and engineering that reproduce similar oversights in the production of visual technologies and algorithms. While we began with the study of pictorial and representational tropes to locate the workings of racial aesthetic paradigms, it may be just as useful to explore absence from representational space to get at how racialized aesthetics play out in our contemporary world. The framework of the void attends to whiteness as its ubiquitous ontology and renders it empty of identifying signifiers, empty of reflection. It is easy to locate erasure as a primary technique of whiteness and its many permutations, from colonial dislocations to cultural exclusion and murder. Western society has long been preoccupied with voids in its imperial conquest into supposedly virgin lands, unknown to white colonizers but long occupied by indigenous inhabitants. Dark bodies as empty vessels to be occupied with classical teachings and Christian values. Voids to be filled with light. Appearing throughout history as both a space to project anxieties and desires pertaining to identity and a place to evade and contest image power, the monochrome offers a useful framework for considering the relation of whiteness to the void. Recent forensic analysis of the iconic black square painting by Russian suprematist Kazimir Malevich reveals racial sentiments embedded beneath the surface of a work that marks a moment of radical transition for abstraction. The work, known as a radical turn in non-objective abstraction in the 0 point of painting, cannot help but also locate Malevich's quest for aesthetic purity beside preoccupations with the black body. We now know that hidden beneath layers of paint, Malevich scrawled what could be considered a racially inflected joke. The words "Battle of Negroes in a Dark Cave" are directly lifted from a satirical work by Paul Billard made 3 decades before, intended to ridicule the absurd pictorial logics apparently moving painting toward new non-objectivity. The original print of Combat des Nègres dans une cave pendant la nuit is perhaps the first monochromatic artwork and betrays the central anxieties of the white psyche, namely that of the aggressive and violent potential of the black body and disorientation within non-pictorial space, expressed as comic absurdity. Is it any mistake that the monochrome, the teleological endpoint of the Western pictorial project, would also be the point from which these artists reveal their racial anxieties? Perhaps it's some combination of the historical context of colonialism and the self-reflexiveness of formalist lexicons that these paintings portray an awareness of the racial implications of color and absence of image. As Arthur Jaffa points out in his essay, My Black Death, the looming black monolith central to the narrative of Stanley Kubrick's landmark science fiction film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, similarly embodies the monochrome as a conduit for post-corporeal transcendence, leading mankind through its evolution from ape to disembodied pure consciousness. Jaffa points out the link between the dense cosmic blackness of the monolith and the terrifying expanse of outer space, where the white protagonist finds himself cast in his new form as the luminous star child after encounter with the monolith on Saturn. One of the film's final images is a monolith in a gleaming white bedroom, decked out with various signifiers of classical white European aesthetics. Boundless black space is once again a trigger for white fears of genetic annihilation, as well as a conduit for cognitive advancement and futuristic embodiments. Blackness tends towards the void in that it is subjected to exclusions and obfuscations within the dominant order, just as it is paradoxically subject to violent hyperpresence. The abyss rendered by erasures and bodily appropriations of whiteness are distilled by Jordan Peele in his 2017 film Get Out, through the depiction of the sunken place as the outside of self-possession. Having lost ownership of one's own black body, newly colonized by an aging white brain, what is left of the previous inhabitant is cast into the gaping maw of nothingness. The sunken place is now firmly established in popular culture parlance as a succinct encapsulation of a loss of social and emotional agency, defining the black experience from times of slavery to our present. The project of multiculturalism sought to redress the historical erasures of non-white experience through making signifiers of difference visible. This approach to positive representation has historically been at the heart of subaltern liberation movements, and representation remains a central territory for contesting power and claiming humanity for many. It certainly dominates mainstream conversations about social equity. However, as Fred Moten reminds us, the wish for recognition in the light of representation presents a real dilemma, whereby inclusion within a paradigm designed to reproduce racial exclusion reaffirms systems that enact our oppression as objects subject to the colonial vision. Investment in positive representation has also left the normative position of whiteness largely unmarked and unproblematized as a real aesthetic and historical construction. Positive representation yields diminishing returns and even tends toward appropriation within visual economies centered around whiteness. Meanwhile, whiteness remains untroubled by the pervasiveness of its own image and continues to satisfy its appetite for difference through tokens of diverse casting, curation, and public programming, for instance. The reproduction of marginality continues unencumbered as its essence remains unproblematically perceived as simply a majority culture with a hint of color. Visual rhetoric remains a strong force for humanizing melanated subjects within this talk should not be mistaken as an argument against what I call positive representation. What I and many other artists and theorists would argue for is an understanding of the ways in which vision in the West has operated violently against people of color, and how scopic regimes of surveillance and policing continue to perpetuate violence and oppression. Opposition to the surface essence thesis has long been a hallmark of resistance to the dominant order wherein survival has hung in the balance, and movements where visual identification means survival or extermination. The imperative to escape from view extends from the marooned slave's flight into the abyss beyond the plantations, to the automatic physical reflexes and intuitive evasions in my body when I see a cop during a lonely evening walk. While these visual evasions are meant to ensure safety and survival, it is also worth noting the aesthetic tendencies to disappear and dealings with abstraction as movements towards refuge from the representational limitations imposed by the anti-blackness of visual culture and the metonymic impositions of respectability politics. I'd like to discuss briefly some examples of such fugitive embodiments and touch on how movements away from, around, and through recognition, performed in large part by artists of color in the first quarter of the 21st century, are in fact adaptations of old tactics of marronage that have meant survival for our ancestors throughout time. As contemporary art historian Sampata Aranki puts it, these aesthetic practitioners deform traditional modes of representation which rely on sight as the primary sense of meaning-making, and obscure visibility as a way to call attention to how looking itself is dependent upon surveillance and policing as dual processes of the criminalization of Black life. The story of Henry Box Brown underscores, through a peculiar narrative, the links taken by enslaved to find freedom from the death hold of whiteness by way of disappearance into the void. Henry Box Brown became famous in his day as the slave who shipped himself to freedom by enclosing himself within a wooden shipping crate and mailing himself from Virginia north into the hands of abolitionist allies in Philadelphia. By leaning into his given status as an object, rendered by the subjection of legal enslavement, he rode the logistical channels of capital to his freedom. This act of invisibility would later provide the basis for his livelihood as he worked as a magician in London after claiming his freedom. His initial fugitive act provided an enduring aesthetic tactic for survival. The Erased Lynching series by artist Ken Gonzalez-Day uses appropriated images of postcards depicting graphic lynchings of mostly Black, but also Indigenous and Asian people to redress this long history of racial brutality in the United States. In these altered photographs, the violated body is momentarily spirited away from the scene of their torture. Gonzalez-Day redacts the victimized body, leaving the viewer with the gaze of the white mob, recasting them as the central actors of this death ritual. In this similarly appropriated and redacted image, Martine Whitehead connects the lynchings of the 19th and 20th centuries to racialized violence in the present, removing the body of Eric Garner from the moment of his murder at the hands of New York policemen. These acts of removal cannot succeed in their apparent wish to retrieve the individuals from the scenes of their brutal subjection. They can, however, direct us back to the genocidal tendencies of whiteness and the representational mediums that facilitate the reproduction of its terrors. Through her artistic practice premised on the notion that blackness is an adaptive and fungible technology in its own right, Sandra Perry proposes monochromatic voids like the blue screen used to create immersive digital spaces in video production as a space for imagining an infinite beyond for blackness. As a digital key to an endless array of spaces other than our own, the blue screen for Perry disturbs our assumptions about where black bodies belong and our relation to material and technological power structures. Perry's blue void is a potential for opacity, what Edward Glissant describes as the manner of being beyond exclusion and singularity, outside of the essentializing demands for transparency and away from purity. How can we exist in relation outside of the outside of the violent acts and implications of Western vision? Where can we practice what Moten calls the pathological vitality of black life without a second thought to look over our shoulders? Not an avoidance of or striving toward representation, but a naked disregard for what is seen. To be so fully as to stop caring what is seen and by whom. What if we quit our efforts to appear or disappear and inhabit the space of not giving a fuck? This could be the space of aesthesis, where, as Rolando Vasquez writes, we stop struggling for novelty and futurity and set our intentions on recovering relationality. I'd like to leave off with a meditation on this feel beyond the visible through a work made in collaboration with some near and some far from me. The offer is not a concrete suggestion, but maybe a space to feel while suspending knowing, to behold pure relation and to stave off the impositions of spectacular looking. What if racial being is not only scopic and representational, but vibrational?